The summer sun shone brightly over the quiet, beautiful landscape of Arlington National Cemetery. The tall green trees stood perfectly still, their leaves hardly moving in the warm air. A light breeze passed through every now and then, but it wasn't strong enough to cool the people who were slowly walking through the pathways. Some came with their families, some came alone, but almost everyone walked softly and spoke in low voices. This was not just another tourist place. It was a place that carried stories, real stories about people who had given their lives in service. At the center of this peaceful ground stood the tomb of the unknown soldier. It was built from white stone, smooth and shining under the afternoon sun. The place was completely silent except for the steady sound of footsteps, sharp, clear, and perfectly timed. It was the sound of the guard who walked back and forth, keeping watch. This guard did not smile, did not look around, and did not get distracted by anything happening nearby. His steps were measured, his posture straight as a line, and his eyes looked straight ahead with full focus. Every person who came here noticed the guard first. There was something special about how he moved. Every step had purpose. Every turn was crisp. People whispered to each other, trying not to make any noise. They felt the weight of the place. Many even stood still just to watch him march in silence. Among the crowd that day was a man who didn't quite blend in with the others. He wore a loose shirt, his sunglasses slightly tilted, and he spoke much louder than everyone else. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't standing still. He laughed from time to time, even when no one was talking to him. Some people in the crowd gave him quiet looks, the kind people give when they hope someone will understand without them having to say anything. But he didn't seem to notice. This man had arrived a little later than the others. He had come with a few friends, but they were more interested in taking pictures near the entrance. He, on the other hand, walked closer to where the guard was marching. He folded his arms and tilted his head slightly, as if he was trying to figure out why everyone was so serious. The closer he got, the more he noticed how strict everything looked. There were small ropes marking where visitors were allowed to stand. There were signs asking for silence and respect. There were guards standing at a distance, making sure everything stayed peaceful. But above all, there was this one soldier marching alone, perfectly still except for the movement of his legs and arms. The man looked around. The people near him were standing quietly, some holding their phones low, afraid to make any noise. He didn't quite understand why they were all so quiet. To him, it felt a little too strict. He let out a small laugh. A few people turned their heads, surprised by the sound. A child held her father's hand and whispered, "Why is he laughing?" The father just shook his head softly, hoping the man would calm down. But the man didn't stop. He moved a little closer to the rope and watched the guard carefully. The guard didn't look at him, not even for a second. His expression didn't change at all. He just walked, turned, and walked again. The man's smile widened, almost like he wanted attention. He made a small comment to the person next to him, something like, "He's just walking back and forth." "That's it." The person didn't reply. They didn't want to be part of it. More people started to notice now. A group of school students, a couple standing near the flowers, even a tour guide who had been quietly explaining the history to a small group. Everyone felt something was different. The atmosphere had shifted a little. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't the same peaceful silence anymore. The man crossed his arms again, still watching the soldier. In his mind, he thought the guard might react if he said something louder. He had no idea how much discipline and responsibility was tied to this place. The soldier, meanwhile, remained calm. His training had taught him not to react to distractions. He was here for something bigger than himself. His duty was not just about standing there. It was about protecting a symbol of honor, something many visitors came to feel, not just to see. A soft warning came from one of the security personnel standing a little farther away. "Sir, please remain behind the rope." The voice was polite but firm. The man gave a small shrug, pretending like he didn't care. A few people in the crowd exchanged worried looks. One woman whispered to her friend, "I hope he doesn't do anything foolish." The atmosphere grew heavier. Even the birds that had been flying above seemed to disappear. Everyone's eyes began to shift between the man and the guard, like they were waiting for something to happen. The man tapped his foot, then took half a step forward. He was still behind the rope, but it was close enough to make the security team alert. One of the officers took a few steps closer, watching him carefully. Meanwhile, the guard kept marching. His boots hit the ground with the same sound as before, steady, clear, and powerful. That sound filled the space. It reminded everyone where they were. It reminded everyone of the meaning behind this ceremony. Somewhere in the crowd, an older gentleman wearing a veteran's hat stood silently with his hands behind his back. His eyes didn't move away from the guard. For him, this wasn't just a ceremony. It was something deeply personal. He knew people who had served. He knew the sacrifices that had been made. He glanced at the loud man with quiet disappointment. The man let out another small laugh. Louder this time. "He's not even looking at me," he said under his breath. The security officer said again, a bit more firmly, "Sir, please be respectful." But the man didn't move back. In fact, he slowly raised his hand as if trying to wave at the guard, trying to get his attention. The people near him stiffened. No one dared speak. The guard, of course, didn't break his focus. His eyes stayed forward. His training was clear. The mission came before anything else. Every second felt longer now. Even the breeze seemed to stop. The man's behavior was not loud enough to cause chaos, but it was enough to break the fragile silence of the place. A mother quietly pulled her children a little farther away. A group of students stopped whispering and watched closely. The tour guide lowered his voice to a whisper so soft it almost disappeared. The man looked around at the people. He noticed they were watching him. For a brief second, he seemed to enjoy the attention, but he didn't truly understand what kind of place he was in. The guard came to the end of his march, paused for a sharp second, and turned. That turn, the clean, practiced, precise turn, made the air around the crowd feel tighter. People held their breath. The man stared, expecting something else to happen. But the guard simply continued his duty. The man stepped closer again, his shoe now only a few inches from the rope. The security guard's hand moved toward the radio clipped to his belt. He didn't want to make a scene, but he also couldn't let anyone disturb the ceremony. The guard's boots continued their rhythm. Step, 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 turn, step. It was in moments like this that people often realized how strong silence can be. No one spoke, but the message was clear. This was not a place for jokes or noise or careless behavior. The man glanced down at the rope. He was close to close. The officer took another step in his direction, not saying anything this time, but making it clear with his presence. For a moment, it seemed like the man might finally understand. He hesitated slightly, shifting his weight from one foot to another. The people around him held their breath, hoping he would step back. But then, something inside him, maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, pushed him the other way. He tilted his chin up and raised his voice a little, speaking directly into the air. Not to anyone in particular. A few people gasped softly, not because of the words, but because of where they were. His voice felt out of place in that quiet space. The security officer spoke again, this time standing just a few steps behind him. "Sir, I need you to step back. Right now." The tone was still calm, but it carried weight. The man didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the guard. The guard, meanwhile, had not broken his focus even once. His every movement showed discipline, and the way he held his shoulders showed strength and dignity. This was not a job for him, it was an oath. The older veteran in the crowd straightened his back a little. He remembered his own time in uniform. Watching the guard reminded him of the sense of respect that came with wearing it. The crowd was now fully silent. The sound of the guard's boots felt louder than ever. Step, step, step. The man stood near the rope, unmoving, with the officer right behind him, even though nothing dramatic had happened yet. Everyone could feel the tension in the air. It was like standing in the middle of a storm before the rain falls, quiet, still, heavy. The guard reached the end of his march again. This time, as he turned, his eyes locked forward, perfectly aligned. The man was standing right there in that line of sight, not because the guard was looking at him personally, but because his position had brought him into the ceremonial path. The man let out a small sound, half a laugh, half a comment, but it faded quickly. It felt weak in the thick silence. At that very second, something shifted. It wasn't something big. It was something subtle but powerful. The guard paused slightly longer at his mark. His boots hit the ground with a firm, strong sound that echoed around the marble. His presence filled the air. It was no longer just a soldier walking. It was history standing. It was discipline standing. It was respect standing. And even the man. The air around the tomb grew still. The sound of the guard's steps echoed softly across the white stone path. Each step clear and strong, almost like the beat of a drum. The crowd's quiet breath matched the rhythm of those steps. It was as if the entire place had come together to listen to that single sound. The man near the robe, who had been standing with a careless attitude just moments earlier, now felt something he hadn't felt before that day, a strange kind of weight in the air. He wasn't sure what it was at first. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't exactly guilt. It was something deeper. The feeling came not from what anyone said, but from the silence, the stillness, and the way the guard stood at the end of his march, strong, calm, and unshaken, for a few long seconds. The man didn't move. He just stared. The sunlight hit the guard's uniform, making the metal buttons shine. The guard's shoulders were pulled back, his posture flawless. His hands placed perfectly where they were supposed to be. He looked like a statue, but alive, a living symbol of discipline and respect. The man let out a slow breath. It was quiet, but in the stillness of that moment, even the softest sound felt loud. He looked around. He saw the faces of the people watching him. Some were serious. Some were disappointed. Some were simply quiet, waiting to see what he would do. His eyes stopped at the old veteran standing at the back of the crowd. The man in the veteran hat wasn't saying anything, but his face, lined with years of experience, carried a quiet message. It was a look that spoke without words. You're standing on ground where silence means something. The man shifted his weight. A small part of him wanted to turn and walk away quickly, pretending nothing had happened. Another part of him felt a strange kind of pride that didn't want to back down. But deeper than both of those feelings, something else was growing inside him, a soft, slow realization that this place wasn't about him at all. The guard didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence was enough. His steps, his discipline, his comment was all a language of its own. The security officer was still standing a few feet behind the man, ready if needed, but not pushing him. The officer's eyes were calm, too. Everyone seemed to be waiting, but no one was rushing. The weight of the silence filled the space completely. The man took a small step back, not much, just enough for the people around him to notice. It wasn't because someone forced him to. It was because something inside him told him it was the right thing to do. And in that moment, the guard began to march again. His steps resumed their perfect rhythm, steady and strong. Step, step, turn, step. It was as if the world itself had let out a breath of relief. The crowd's shoulders relaxed slightly. The tension in the air softened, like a knot slowly loosening. The man stood quietly now. His hands, which had been crossed earlier, slowly fell to the sides. His smile was gone, not out of shame exactly, but because he finally understood that this wasn't a place for jokes or noise. This was a place built on respect. A soft whisper passed through the crowd as someone explained to a child, "That guard will never leave his post. Not for rain, not for snow, not for anything. That's how serious it is." The child's eyes grew wide, amazed. Even she could feel how meaningful it was. The man heard those words too. For the first time, he truly noticed everything around him. The flowers lay gently near the memorial, the flags waving softly in the wind, the names written on plaques, the quiet way people held themselves as they stood in front of the tomb. This was not just stone and marble. This was memory. This was sacrifice. This was respect. The security officer slowly stepped back, realizing he didn't need to say anything more. The man was no longer standing like before. His entire body language had changed. His shoulders were lower, his steps slower, his eyes quieter. For the first time that day, he stood completely still. The guard's boots clicked on the ground again. Step, step, turn, step. The sound was no longer just a rhythm. Now it felt like a heartbeat, steady and unbreakable. The man watched. He no longer wanted to talk. He no longer wanted attention. All he wanted was to understand what everyone else already seemed to feel. The guard reached the end of his line and stopped sharply. His body didn't sway. His gaze didn't waver. It was perfect. It was as if the guard himself had become a piece of the tomb, a living part of its story. The man lowered his head slightly. He wasn't forced to. No one told him to. But deep inside, he felt it was the right thing to do. Minutes passed, but no one noticed the time anymore. In that silence, something powerful grew. The people weren't just watching a guard. They were witnessing a kind of promise, a promise that someone would always stand here, no matter what, to honor those who could no longer speak for themselves. The man thought about his own life. He thought about how easily he had laughed when he came here, how lightly he had treated a place that held so much meaning for others. He didn't feel proud of it now, but he didn't feel attacked either. He just felt quiet. He slowly stepped away from the rope, joining the rest of the crowd. Nobody said anything to him. They didn't need to. The silence round the tomb was louder than any words could ever be. The guard kept marching. Step, step, turn, step. The man stood in the crowd for several more minutes, watching. The more he watched, the more he understood. The guard wasn't walking back and forth because it was easy. He was doing it because it was a promise. A promise to those who never came back. A promise to the families who came to visit. A promise to the country that someone would always stand here, rain or shine, night or day. A mother holding her child whispered, "He doesn't stop. They stand like this for hours, without moving. That's how strong their discipline is." The man glanced at the child, who was watching the guard with wide eyes full of admiration. Something in that moment touched him deeply. It wasn't a big event. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was just real. He realized that respect isn't always taught through lectures or warnings. Sometimes it's taught through silence, through actions, through standing still and understanding something bigger than yourself. The old veteran at the back gave a small nod, not to the man directly, but almost as if he understood that something had changed. The man saw the nod, and for a brief second, their eyes met. No words were needed. That simple look carried more meaning than any conversation could. The man stepped back a little more and stood near a tree, away from the center. He folded his hands together, not in arrogance this time, but in quiet reflection. The sun shifted slightly in the sky. The wind moved gently, brushing against the leaves. A flag nearby fluttered softly. The whole place felt alive with quiet strength. The man closed his eyes for a moment, not to block anything out, but to let it in. He thought about how he had walked in, laughing, without understanding. And now, he stood still, humbled by something he couldn't fully explain in words. When the ceremony ended, the guard paused, stood tall, and then slowly walked toward the next part of his duty. Another guard would replace him with the same discipline, the same silence, the same strength. The crowd began to disperse slowly. Some people took quiet photos. Some simply walked away without saying a word. But everyone carried a piece of that silence with them. The man waited until almost everyone had left. He didn't rush. He didn't joke. He walked slowly toward the exit, his steps soft and thoughtful as he passed the security officer. Their eyes met for a brief second. The officer didn't say anything, but his expression was calm, almost understanding. The man gave a small nod. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet, respectful nod. Outside the tomb area, the noise of the world returned, cars, chatter, footsteps. But something inside the man was different now. He felt quieter. He felt smaller in a good way, like he had stood in front of something bigger than himself. He didn't tell anyone about it right away. He didn't try to explain it. Some things can't be explained. They can only be felt. Later that evening, when he met his friends again, they joked and talked like before. But when they asked him what he did at the tomb, he simply said it was different. He didn't say much more, but his voice was softer over time. He would tell the story to others not as a story about himself, but as a lesson. A lesson about a guard who stood still. A lesson about a place where silence spoke louder than any words. A lesson about how one moment of understanding can change how a person sees the world. He would describe how the guard's footsteps had filled the air like a heartbeat, how the crowd had fallen silent, how the weight of respect had wrapped around everyone standing their dot, and how he had learned, without anyone yelling at him, that some places demand quiet not because someone says so, but because they hold too much meaning to be treated lightly. The man never forgot that moment. Every time he saw a flag flutter in the wind after that day, he remembered the guard. He remembered the silence. He remembered the lesson. He never stood carelessly at a memorial again, because that day, without anyone raising their voice, without any harsh words, without any force, he learned something that would stay with him for life. Respect is not demanded, it is felt.